The Dacians were fierce mountain warriors. They carried wolf-headed standards into battle that screamed in the wind. They built sacred fortresses high in the Carpathian peaks, where priests spoke to the gods. For centuries, they stood against the mightiest empire the world had ever known. Their king chose death over surrender. Their people chose freedom over chains. This is the complete story of the Dacians. Welcome and settle in for a long journey through time. Tonight, we travel back more than 2,000 years to a land of misty mountains and dense forests. A land where wolves howled in the darkness and warriors trained from childhood to face any enemy. This is the story of the Dacians, a proud and ancient people who carved their place in history through courage, faith, and an unbreakable will to remain free. The Dacians lived in the region we now call Romania and parts of the surrounding countries. Their homeland stretched across the Carpathian Mountains and the Transylvanian Plateau. It was a land of stunning natural beauty. Imagine tall peaks covered in snow during the long winters. Picture vast forests of oak and beech trees that seem to go on forever. Think of rivers cutting through valleys, where villages clustered along the banks. This was Dacia, and it shaped everything about the people who called it home. The mountains gave the Dacians natural protection from invaders. The forests provided wood for building and fuel for fires. The rivers offered fish and water for crops. The soil was rich and good for farming. Gold and silver hid in the rocks, waiting to be discovered. The Dacians learned to use all of these gifts. They became skilled farmers, talented metal workers, and brave warriors. The land made them strong, and they loved it deeply. To understand the Dacians, we must first understand where they came from. They did not simply appear one day in the Carpathian Mountains. Their roots stretch back thousands of years to the ancient Thracian peoples. The Thracians were one of the largest groups of people in the ancient world. They lived across a huge area that included modern-day Bulgaria, Romania, parts of Greece, Turkey, Serbia, and beyond. Ancient writers said the Thracians were so numerous that if they ever united under one leader, they would be unstoppable. But they never did unite, at least not all of them. They remained divided into many different tribes and groups. The Dacians were one branch of this great Thracian family tree. They lived in the northern part of the Thracian world, in and around the Carpathian Mountains. Their close relatives, the Getae, lived nearby, mostly south of the Danube River and in the plains. Ancient Greek and Roman writers sometimes used the names Dacian and Getae interchangeably. This has caused some confusion over the centuries. Were they the same people or different? The truth seems to be that they were very closely related, speaking the same language or very similar dialects, sharing the same gods and following similar customs. The main difference was geography. The Dacians lived in the mountains, while the Getae lived in the lowlands and plains. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, gave us some of our earliest written accounts of these people. He called the Getae the bravest and most just of the Thracians. He was particularly fascinated by their religious beliefs, especially their faith in immortality. We will explore these beliefs in great detail later, for they were central to everything the Dacians did and everything they were willing to sacrifice. The Dacians spoke a language that belonged to the Indo-European family. This means their tongue was distantly related to Greek, Latin, Celtic, Germanic, and many other ancient languages. Sadly, almost nothing of the Dacian language survives today. They did not leave behind written texts or literature. What we know of their words comes from place names, personal names, and the names of plants that ancient writers recorded. Scholars have spent centuries trying to piece together what Dacian sounded like and how it worked. It remains one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. The Dacians did not have their own alphabet in the early centuries. Later, they began to use Greek letters for some purposes, but they never developed a rich written tradition like the Greeks or Romans. This means we must rely on what others wrote about them, along with what archaeologists have discovered in the ground. Fortunately, both sources have given us a great deal of information. We can now paint a fairly detailed picture of Dacian life, even if some mysteries remain. Let us talk about the physical appearance of the Dacians, as ancient writers described them. They were said to be tall and strong, with fair skin and light-coloured hair. Many had reddish or blonde hair, though darker shades existed too. The men often wore their hair long, and beards were common among warriors and nobles. The women also kept their hair long, sometimes braiding it in elaborate styles. Roman artwork, especially the famous carvings on Trajan's column in Rome, shows us Dacian men with thick beards and distinctive caps. These images are some of our best visual records of what the Dacians looked like. The Dacians were not isolated from the wider world. They traded with Greek colonies along the Black Sea coast. They exchanged goods with Celtic peoples to the west. They had contact with Scythian nomads from the steppes. Later, they dealt with the Romans, sometimes as trading partners and sometimes as enemies. Through all these contacts, the Dacians absorbed influences from other cultures while maintaining their own distinct identity. They took what they found useful and made it their own. Greek merchants brought wine, olive oil, fine pottery and luxury goods to Dacia. In return, the Dacians offered grain, honey, wax, furs, slaves, and precious metals. Gold was particularly important. The Carpathian Mountains contained significant deposits of gold, and the Dacians became skilled at mining and working this precious metal. Dacian gold would later become one of the main reasons Rome turned its hungry eyes toward this mountain kingdom. The early centuries of Dacian history are shrouded in mystery. We know they existed as distinct tribes long before any written records mentioned them. Archaeological evidence shows continuous settlements in the Carpathian region going back to the Bronze Age and beyond. The people who would become the Dacians slowly developed their culture over many generations. They learned to work metal, first bronze and then iron. They built hill forts for protection. They buried their dead with grave goods for the afterlife. They created arts that expressed their beliefs and values. By the time Greek writers began mentioning them, the Dacians had already developed a sophisticated society. They had social classes, religious institutions, and political structures. They were not primitive savages, despite what some Roman propaganda later claimed. They were a complex civilization adapted perfectly to their mountain homeland. The relationship between the Dacians and their southern neighbours, the Greeks, was mostly peaceful and commercial. Greek colonies like Histria, Tomis, and Calatis dotted the western Black Sea coast. These cities served as trading posts where Greek and Dacian worlds met. The Greeks were interested in profit, not conquest, at least in this region. They were happy to trade with the Dacians rather than fight them. This arrangement worked well for both sides for several centuries. The Dacians learned things from the Greeks. They adopted some Greek artistic styles. They used Greek coins and eventually Greek letters. Some Dacian nobles may have learned to speak Greek, but they never became Greek. They remained proudly Dacian, holding on to their own gods, their own customs, and their own way of life. This ability to learn from others without losing themselves would serve the Dacians well in the centuries ahead. As we move deeper into Dacian history, we will meet remarkable individuals and witness dramatic events. We will see the rise of great kings who united the tribes. We will watch the Dacians build magnificent fortresses in the mountains. We will follow their long struggle against Rome, the greatest military power of the ancient world. We will witness their final defeat and the death of their last king, and we will trace their legacy down through the centuries to the present day. But before we reach those dramatic chapters, we must first understand the foundations of Dacian society. We must explore their religion, which shaped every aspect of their lives. We must examine their social structure their economy, their art, and their warfare. Only by understanding these foundations can we truly appreciate the story that follows. So let us continue our journey into the world of the Dacians. Let us walk through their villages and climb to their mountain sanctuaries. Let us meet their priests and their warriors, their farmers and their craftsmen. Let us discover what made these people so special that their memory has endured for more than 2,000 years. The religion of the Dacians stands as one of the most fascinating aspects of their civilization. At the centre of their spiritual world was a deity named Zalmoxis. Ancient writers were deeply intrigued by this god and the beliefs surrounding him. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded what he learned about Zalmoxis from Greeks who lived near Dacian territory. His account, written around 440 years before the Common Era, remains our most important ancient source on Dacian religion. According to Herodotus, the Getae believed that they did not truly die. Instead, they went to join Zalmoxis after leaving this world. Zalmoxis was not merely a god to them. He was a promise of eternal life. This belief in immortality made the Dacians fearless in battle. Why fear death if death is simply a doorway to a better existence? This concept would puzzle and impress the Greeks and Romans for centuries. Herodotus also recorded a strange story that some Greeks told about Zalmoxis. According to this tale, Zalmoxis was originally a man, a slave who had belonged to the famous Greek philosopher Pythagoras. After gaining his freedom, Zalmoxis returned to his homeland among the Thracians. There, he built a great hall where he entertained the leading men of the tribe. He taught them that neither he nor they, nor their descendants, would ever die. Instead, they would go to a place where they would live forever in complete happiness. While teaching these things, Zalmoxis was secretly building an underground chamber. When it was finished, he disappeared into this hidden room and lived there for 3 years. The Thracians mourned him as dead. Then in the 4th year, he reappeared among them. His return from apparent death convinced everyone that his teachings were true. From that point on, the people believed in the immortality he promised. Herodotus himself was skeptical of this story. He thought Zalmoxis probably lived long before Pythagoras and was genuinely a divine being rather than a clever trickster. Modern scholars have debated the meaning of this account endlessly. Some see it as Greek rationalization of a foreign religion they did not understand. Others think it may contain kernels of truth about shamanistic practices among the ancient Thracians. Whatever the truth, the story shows how seriously the Greeks took Dacian religious beliefs. The worship of Zalmoxis involved rituals that shocked outside observers. Every 5 years, according to Herodotus, the Dacians would choose a messenger to send to their god. They would give this person a list of things they needed and prayers they wanted delivered. Then they would throw the messenger onto upturned spears. If he died from the wounds, they believed Zalmoxis had received their message favourably. If he survived, they blamed the messenger for being unworthy and chose another. This practice of human sacrifice disturbed the Greeks and Romans deeply, yet it also earned the Dacians a reputation for absolute devotion to their beliefs. A people willing to sacrifice their own in such a manner would clearly stop at nothing in defence of their faith and their freedom. This reputation would serve the Dacians well when facing enemies who might otherwise underestimate them. The priests who served Zalmoxis held enormous power in Dacian society. They were not merely religious figures, but also political advisors, judges, and keepers of knowledge. The chief priest held a position second only to the king himself. In some periods, the chief priest may have held even more influence than the king in certain matters. This close connection between religious and political authority was a defining feature of Dacian civilization. The priests lived apart from ordinary people, following strict rules of behaviour and diet. Ancient sources tell us that Dacian priests practiced vegetarianism, refusing to eat meat or kill animals. This was unusual in the ancient world, where animal sacrifice was common in most religions. The Dacian priests believed that abstaining from meat kept them spiritually pure and closer to the divine realm. The priests also served as healers and keepers of medical knowledge. They understood the properties of plants and herbs. They knew which ones could cure illness and which ones could cause harm. This knowledge gave them additional power and respect in society. When someone fell sick, they would turn to the priests for help. When someone needed guidance, the priests would interpret the will of the gods. Beyond Zalmoxis, the Dacians worshipped other deities as well. We know some of their names from ancient sources, though details about them are scarce. Decebalus was a sky god associated with thunder and lightning. Some scholars believe Decebalus and Zalmoxis may have been the same deity under different names, or perhaps different aspects of the same divine being. The relationship between these gods remains unclear. The Dacians also revered nature spirits and believed the natural world was filled with divine presence. Mountains, rivers, forests and springs all had spiritual significance. Certain locations were considered especially sacred, places where the boundary between the human world and the divine realm grew thin. The Dacians built sanctuaries at these sacred sites, creating spaces for worship and communion with the gods. The most important sacred sites were located in the Orishti Mountains of Transylvania. Here, at places like Sarmizegetusa Regia, the Dacians constructed elaborate sanctuary complexes. These were not temples in the Greek or Roman sense. They were open-air sacred spaces marked by stone circles, wooden pillars, and carefully arranged architectural elements. The layout of these sanctuaries suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Some structures appear aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. The great circular sanctuary at Sarmizegetusa Regia is particularly impressive. It consists of a large stone circle surrounded by wooden pillars arranged in precise patterns. Scholars believe this sanctuary served as both a religious centre and an astronomical observatory. The priest could track the seasons, predict eclipses, and determine the proper times for festivals and rituals. This combination of religion and science was common in ancient societies, where understanding the heavens was considered a form of divine knowledge. The Dacians marked their sacred spaces with distinctive symbols. The most important of these was the sun symbol, represented as a wheel or disc with radiating lines. Solar imagery appears frequently in Dacian art, suggesting the sun held special religious significance. This makes sense for an agricultural society dependent on the sun for growing crops. The sun brought warmth, light, and life. It was natural to see it as divine. Another important symbol was the wolf. The Dacians had a special relationship with wolves, seeing them as powerful spiritual beings. The wolf represented courage, ferocity, and the wild spirit of the mountains. Dacian warriors carried standards topped with wolf heads that would howl in the wind as they charged into battle. These Draco standards, as the Romans called them, became one of the most recognizable symbols of Dacian military power. The Draco was more than just a battle standard. It was a religious symbol that connected the warriors to the spiritual realm. When the wind filled the Draco's body and made it howl, the Dacians believed they were hearing the voice of the wolf spirit itself. This sound was meant to terrify enemies and inspire the Dacian warriors. It reminded them that supernatural forces fought alongside them. Death rituals among the Dacians reflected their belief in immortality. When someone died, they were not mourned with excessive grief. Death was seen as a transition, a journey to join Zalmoxis in the realm of eternal happiness. Funeral practices varied depending on the status of the deceased. Common people might be buried simply, while nobles received elaborate burials with grave goods to accompany them to the afterlife. Cremation was practiced alongside burial in some periods. The ashes of the dead might be placed in urns and buried in cemeteries or beneath burial mounds called tumuli. Grave goods included weapons for warriors, jewellery for women, pottery containing food and drink, and personal items the deceased might need in the next world. The quality and quantity of grave goods reflected the social status of the dead person. Some Dacian burials show evidence of ritual feasting. The living would gather to honour the dead with food, drink, and ceremony. These gatherings reinforced social bonds among the living while showing respect for those who had passed on. The dead were not forgotten. They remained part of the community in memory and spirit. The Dacians also practiced divination, seeking to learn the will of the gods and glimpse the future. Priests would interpret signs and omens, looking for messages in the flight of birds, the behaviour of animals, or unusual natural events. Dreams were considered especially important, as they might contain communications from the divine realm. A significant dream before a battle or major decision would be taken very seriously. Religious festivals marked the turning points of the year. The solstices and equinoxes were particularly important, as were planting and harvest times. These festivals brought communities together for worship, feasting, and celebration. They reinforced shared beliefs and strengthened social bonds. Unfortunately, ancient sources tell us little about the specific details of these festivals. We can only guess at the rituals, songs, and ceremonies that filled these sacred occasions. The Dacian religion was not static. It evolved over the centuries, absorbing influences from neighbouring cultures while maintaining its distinctive character. Contact with Greeks brought some Greek religious ideas to Dacia. Later, Roman influence would introduce new elements, but the core beliefs centred on Zalmoxis and immortality persisted throughout Dacian history. These beliefs gave the Dacians their courage in battle and their resilience in the face of adversity. Understanding Dacian religion helps us understand Dacian society as a whole. Religion was not a separate sphere of life confined to temples and holy days. It permeated everything. Political decisions were made with religious guidance. Wars were fought with religious fervour. Daily life was structured around religious observances. To be Dacian was to believe in Zalmoxis and the promise of immortality. This faith united the Dacian people and gave them strength to face whatever challenges came their way. Now let us turn our attention to the structure of Dacian society. Like most ancient civilizations, the Dacians organized themselves into distinct social classes. At the top stood the king and the nobility. Below them came the priests, who held their own special status. Then came the common people, the farmers, craftsmen, and labourers who formed the majority of the population. At the bottom were slaves, captured in war or born into servitude. The Dacian king held supreme political and military authority. He led the army in war and made decisions affecting the entire kingdom. But his power was not absolute. He ruled with the advice of a council of nobles and the guidance of the chief priest. A wise king listened to his advisers and maintained the support of the powerful families. A foolish king who ignored this advice might find himself facing rebellion or assassination. The nobility consisted of a warrior aristocracy called the Tarabostes or Piliati. These nobles wore distinctive felt caps that marked their high status. They owned land, commanded followers, and served as the king's military officers and administrators. The nobles were expected to be skilled warriors, ready to fight whenever the king called. In return for their service, they enjoyed privileges and prestige denied to common people. The common people, called comate or capellati, formed the bulk of Dacian society. The name capellati means the long-haired ones, referring to their hairstyle that distinguished them from the cap-wearing nobles. These ordinary Dacians worked the land, tended livestock, practiced crafts, and performed the countless tasks that kept society functioning. They owed obligations to the nobles and the king, including military service in times of war. The distinction between nobles and commoners was fundamental to Dacian society. It determined what you could wear, where you could live, what rights you enjoyed, and what duties you owed. Social mobility existed but was limited. A common warrior might rise through exceptional bravery, but such advancement was rare. Most people lived and died in the class they were born into. Women in Dacian society occupied a complex position. Ancient sources tell us little about their daily lives, but archaeological evidence and scattered references allow some conclusions. Women managed households, raised children, and performed domestic tasks like weaving and food preparation. Noble women enjoyed higher status and more comfort than common women, but all women were subordinate to men in the formal power structure. However, there are hints that women held more influence than this simple picture suggests. Some Dacian graves contain women buried with rich grave goods, suggesting high status. Certain religious roles may have been open to women, and in any society, the formal power structure does not tell the whole story. Women exercised influence through family relationships, economic activities, and informal channels that leave few traces in the historical record. Marriage among the Dacians followed patterns common in ancient societies. Marriages were arranged by families with considerations of property, alliance, and social status outweighing romantic love. A bride brought a dowry to her husband's family. In return, she gained the protection and support of her new household. Polygamy may have been practiced among the wealthy, allowing powerful men to take multiple wives. Children were valued as the future of the family and the tribe. Boys were raised to become farmers, craftsmen, or warriors depending on their family's status. Girls were trained in domestic skills and prepared for marriage. Education was informal, with children learning from parents, relatives, and community members. The children of nobles likely received more specialized training in warfare, leadership, and perhaps literacy in Greek. The Dacian economy rested primarily on agriculture. The fertile valleys and plains of Dacia supported extensive farming. Wheat, barley, and millet were the main grain crops. Farmers also grew vegetables, fruits, and grapes for wine. Livestock included cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses. Agriculture provided the food surplus that allowed some people to specialize in other activities like crafts, trade, and warfare. Dacian farmers used iron tools that made their work more efficient than earlier bronze implements. Ploughs turned the soil for planting. Sickles harvested the grain. Axes cleared forest land for new fields. The adoption of iron technology was a crucial development that increased agricultural productivity and supported population growth. Beyond farming, the Dacians excelled at various crafts. Metalworking was particularly important. Dacian smiths produced weapons, tools, jewellery, and decorative objects of high quality. They worked in iron, bronze, gold, and silver. The famous Dacian falk sword, with its curved blade designed to hook around shields, was a product of skilled metalworking. Gold and silver jewellery found in Dacian graves show sophisticated techniques, including filigree, granulation, and inlay. Pottery was another important craft. Dacian potters produced both utilitarian vessels for everyday use and finer wares for special occasions. Some pottery shows Greek influence in its shapes and decoration, evidence of the cultural exchange that came through trade. Other pieces maintain distinctly Dacian styles, demonstrating the persistence of local traditions. Textile production occupied many Dacian women. They spun wool and plant fibres into thread, then wove the thread into cloth on looms. The resulting fabric was made into clothing, blankets, and other household items. Dacian clothing was practical for the mountain climate, with wool garments providing warmth in the cold winters. Nobles wore finer fabrics and more elaborate decorations than common people. Trade connected Dacia to the wider ancient world. The Dacians exported grain, livestock, honey, wax, furs, timber, and precious metals. They imported wine, olive oil, fine pottery, glassware, and luxury goods from Greek and later Roman sources. Trade routes crossed Dacia, connecting the Mediterranean world to the peoples of the northern steppes. Dacian merchants and their foreign trading partners grew wealthy from this commerce. Gold deserves special mention in any discussion of the Dacian economy. The Carpathian Mountains contain significant gold deposits, and the Dacians developed sophisticated mining techniques to extract this precious metal. Alluvial gold was panned from rivers and streams. Underground mines followed gold veins deep into the rock. The gold was refined and worked into jewellery, decorative objects, and eventually coins. Dacian gold attracted the attention and envy of neighbouring peoples. Greek colonists traded eagerly for it. Celtic tribes to the west coveted it. And eventually, Roman emperors would launch devastating wars partly to seize control of these golden mountains. The wealth of Dacia was both a blessing and a curse, providing prosperity but also making the kingdom a target. The Dacians eventually adopted coinage, influenced by Greek and Celtic examples. Dacian coins were often imitations of Greek or Macedonian types, showing how foreign models were adapted to local use. Later, under kings like Burebista and Decebalus, more distinctly, Dacian coinage appeared. Coins facilitated trade and allowed the king to pay soldiers and officials. They also served as propaganda, spreading the king's image and authority throughout the realm. Dacian settlements ranged from small farming villages to substantial fortified towns. The typical village consisted of wooden houses clustered together, surrounded by fields and pastures. Houses were built using timber frames with walls of wattle and daub or wooden planks. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds. Inside, a central hearth provided heat and light. Families lived, ate, and slept in these modest but functional homes. Larger settlements developed at strategic locations, especially hilltops, that offered natural defensive advantages. These hill forts, called dava in the Dacian language, served as centres of political, economic, and religious activity. The dava was surrounded by walls and ditches for protection. Inside, you would find the homes of nobles, workshops for craftsmen, storage facilities for grain and other goods, and open spaces for markets and gatherings. The greatest of all Dacian settlements was Sarmizegetusa Regia, the sacred capital in the Orashti Mountains. This was not just a political centre, but a holy place, the spiritual heart of the Dacian kingdom. Here stood the great sanctuaries where priests communed with the gods. Here the kings held court and made decisions affecting the entire nation. Here the treasures of Dacia were stored and guarded. Here the kings held court and made decisions affecting the entire nation. Here the treasures of Dacia were stored and guarded. Sarmizegetusa Regia represented the peak of Dacian civilization, a place where political power and religious authority came together in a dramatic mountain setting. The architecture of Sarmizegetusa Regia and other major Dacian sites shows remarkable sophistication. The Dacians developed a distinctive construction technique using carefully cut limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. This technique, called murus dacicus by modern scholars, produced walls of impressive strength and durability. The precision of the stonework rivals that of contemporary Mediterranean civilizations. The fortifications protecting major Dacian sites were formidable. Walls incorporated towers at regular intervals, allowing defenders to cover attackers from multiple angles. Gates were designed to channel attackers into killing zones. Some fortresses had multiple lines of defence, forcing attackers to breach wall after wall. These fortifications would later give the Roman legions serious trouble during the conquest of Dacia. Daily life for ordinary Dacians followed the rhythms of the agricultural year. Spring brought ploughing and planting. Summer meant tending crops and preparing for harvest. Autumn was the busy season of gathering and storing food for winter. Winter offered some respite from field work, but brought its own challenges of cold and darkness. Throughout the year, religious festivals, market days, and community gatherings broke the routine of daily labour. Food in Dacia was hearty and practical. Bread made from wheat or barley was a staple. Porridge and gruel provided filling meals. Meat came from domesticated animals and wild game hunted in the forests. Fish from rivers and lakes added variety. Vegetables, fruits, and nuts supplemented the diet. Honey served as a sweetener, and of course there was drink, including beer brewed from grain and wine, imported from Greek lands, or eventually produced locally. The Dacians were known for their love of drinking. Ancient writers commented on their fondness for wine and their tendency toward drunkenness at feasts. One story tells of a Dacian king who tried to reform his people's drinking habits with limited success. Feasting and drinking were important social activities, occasions for building relationships, celebrating victories, and honouring the gods. The negative comments from Greek and Roman writers may reflect cultural bias as much as reality. Music and song accompanied Dacian feasts and festivals. Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about what Dacian music sounded like. No instruments have survived intact, and no written descriptions give us details. We can assume they had drums, flutes, and stringed instruments, like other ancient peoples. We can imagine songs celebrating heroes, mourning the dead, and praising the gods, but the actual sounds are lost to us forever. The Dacians decorated themselves and their possessions with distinctive artistic styles. Geometric patterns were common, including spirals, circles, and interlocking designs. Animal motifs appeared frequently, especially wolves, horses, and birds. Human figures were rarer but did occur in some contexts. Dacian art shows influences from Greek, Celtic, and Scythian traditions blended into something uniquely Dacian. Jewellery was important for displaying status and wealth. Both men and women wore ornaments of gold, silver, and bronze. Bracelets, necklaces, rings, and fibulae, which are decorative pins used to fasten clothing, have been found in many Dacian graves. The famous Dacian gold bracelets are particularly impressive. These thick, coiled bracelets were worn on the upper arm and represented significant wealth. Some examples weigh nearly a kilogram of pure gold. The craftsmanship shows sophisticated techniques that required years of training to master. The spiral was a favourite decorative motif among Dacian goldsmiths. Bracelets often featured coiled snake designs, with the ends shaped into animal heads. These serpentine forms may have held religious significance, perhaps representing cycles of death and rebirth, or the eternal nature of the soul. Whatever their meaning, these golden spirals remain among the most beautiful objects to survive from the ancient world. Dacian silverwork was equally impressive. Silver was more common than gold, and appeared in a wider range of objects. Drinking vessels, horse fittings, weapon decorations, and personal ornaments all featured silver craftsmanship. The Dacians sometimes combined silver with gold, creating striking two-toned effects. They also used techniques like gilding, applying thin layers of gold over silver or bronze bases. Clothing in Dacia was practical for the mountain climate, while also expressing social identity. Common people wore simple tunics of wool or linen, belted at the waist. Trousers were worn by both men and women, a practical choice for the cold winters and active lifestyles of mountain dwellers. This distinguished the Dacians from Greeks and Romans, who considered trousers barbaric. Cloaks provided additional warmth and protection from rain and snow. The nobility dressed more elaborately. Their clothing featured finer fabrics, brighter colours, and more decoration. The distinctive felt cap worn by nobles, called a pileus, marked their elevated status at a glance. This cap appears frequently in Roman artwork depicting Dacians, making it one of the most recognisable elements of Dacian appearance. The cap may have had religious significance as well as social meaning. Footwear ranged from simple leather sandals to sturdy boots suitable for mountain terrain. Surviving examples and artistic depictions show that Dacian shoemakers were skilled at their craft. Boots were essential for warriors who might march long distances over rough ground and fight in all weather conditions. Personal grooming was important to the Dacians. Men typically wore beards, often quite long and full. Hair was worn long by common people, while nobles kept theirs shorter beneath their distinctive caps. Women braided their hair in various styles, sometimes incorporating ornaments and decorations. Combs made of bone or wood have been found at Dacian sites, showing attention to hair care. Now that we understand Dacian society and daily life, let us turn to one of the most fascinating aspects of their civilization, the art of war. The Dacians were renowned warriors whose military prowess earned them respect and fear throughout the ancient world. Their weapons, tactics, and warrior culture deserve careful examination. The Dacians were born warriors. From childhood, boys trained in the skills they would need to defend their families, their villages, and their kingdom. They learned to handle weapons, to ride horses, to endure hardship, and to face danger without flinching. The mountains that were their home served as the ultimate training ground, building strength and stamina in those who survived their harsh conditions. The most famous Dacian weapon was the falx. This fearsome blade has become synonymous with Dacian warfare, and for good reason. The falx was a curved sword with a single sharp edge on the inside of the curve. It came in two main varieties. The shorter version, about the length of a man's forearm, was wielded with one hand. The longer version, sometimes called the two-handed falx, required both hands to swing effectively. The design of the falx made it devastatingly effective against armoured opponents. The curved blade could hook around the edge of a shield, striking the arm or body behind it. The inward-facing edge concentrated all the force of a swing onto a small area, allowing it to punch through armour and helmets. Roman soldiers learned to fear the falx above all other barbarian weapons. The falx was so effective against Roman legionaries that it forced changes in Roman military equipment. After early encounters with Dacian warriors, Roman soldiers began reinforcing their helmets with cross braces to protect against the chopping blows of the falx. They added armour to their sword arms, which were particularly vulnerable when raised to strike. These modifications, visible in archaeological finds, testify to the respect Roman commanders had for Dacian weaponry. Beyond the falx, Dacian warriors used a variety of other weapons. Swords of more conventional design served as sidearms. Spears and javelins allowed attacks at range before closing to hand-to-hand combat. Daggers provided backup weapons for close-quarters fighting. Bows and arrows equipped some warriors for ranged combat, though the Dacians were not primarily an archery-focused culture like their Scythian neighbours. Dacian shields were typically oval or rectangular, made of wood covered with leather. Some had metal bosses in the centre and metal edging for additional strength. The shield was essential for defence, protecting the warrior from enemy missiles and sword strokes. Skilled fighters learned to use the shield offensively as well, punching with the boss or edge to create openings for their own attacks. Armour varied according to wealth and status. Common warriors might fight with little more than a shield and their ordinary clothing. Wealthier fighters wore shirts of mail made from thousands of interlocking iron rings. The very wealthy might have scale armour or even captured Roman equipment. Helmets protected the head, ranging from simple leather caps to elaborate metal designs. The nobility could afford the best protection, while ordinary soldiers made do with what they could obtain. The Dacian military was organised around the tribal and social structures of their society. Each noble commanded a following of warriors who owed him personal loyalty. These warbands formed the core of Dacian armies. When the king called for war, the nobles would gather their followers and march to join the royal host. The size of the army depended on how many nobles responded and how many men each could bring. Cavalry played an important role in Dacian warfare. The Dacians bred horses suited to mountain terrain, smaller and surer-footed than the horses of the plains. Noble warriors often fought on horseback, using their mobility to scout, skirmish, and pursue fleeing enemies. Cavalry could also deliver devastating charges against infantry formations, though the rough terrain of Dacia often limited opportunities for such tactics. Infantry formed the bulk of Dacian armies. These foot soldiers fought in loose formations suited to the broken terrain of their homeland. Unlike the rigid formations of Roman legions, Dacian infantry relied on individual skill and courage rather than tight discipline. This approach had advantages in mountain warfare, where terrain made maintaining formations difficult. It also had weaknesses when facing the organised might of Rome on more open ground. The Dacians excelled at defensive warfare. Their mountain homeland offered countless opportunities for ambushes, defensive positions, and strategic retreats. A small force of Dacian warriors could hold a mountain pass against a much larger enemy. They knew every trail, every hiding place, every advantage their terrain offered. Invaders who ventured into the Carpathians faced a nightmare of constant attacks, supply problems, and an enemy who seemed to appear and disappear at will. Siege warfare was another Dacian strength. Their fortresses, built with the sophisticated Murus Dacicus technique, could withstand prolonged attacks. Thick walls, strong towers, and clever defensive designs made these strongholds formidable obstacles. The Dacians stockpiled food, water, and weapons to endure long sieges. They also understood how to conduct sieges themselves, having learned techniques from Greek and later Roman sources. Now we come to one of the most iconic symbols of Dacian military power, the Draco standard. This remarkable battle flag has captured imaginations for 2,000 years. The Draco was a wind instrument as much as a banner. It consisted of a metal wolf's head mounted on a pole with a long tube of fabric attached to form the body. When the wind blew through the open mouth, it filled the fabric body and produced an eerie howling sound. Imagine the effect on a battlefield. Hundreds of these Draco standards, held high by Dacian warriors, their fabric bodies writhing like living serpents, their wolf mouths screaming in the wind. The sound must have been terrifying, a chorus of howls that seemed to come from supernatural creatures rather than mere flags. For the Dacians, this sound represented the voice of the wolf spirit fighting alongside them. For their enemies, it was the sound of nightmares. The Draco combined several symbolic elements. The wolf head represented the fierce spirit of the Dacian warrior and connected to their religious beliefs about wolves as powerful spiritual beings. The serpentine body may have represented a dragon or snake, creatures with their own mythological significance. The combination created something unique, a wolf-dragon hybrid that became the defining symbol of Dacian military identity. Roman soldiers were so impressed by the Draco that they eventually adopted it for their own use. After the conquest of Dacia, the Draco standard spread throughout the Roman army. It remained in use for centuries, long after the Dacian kingdom had ceased to exist. In this way, the Dacian Draco achieved a kind of immortality, continuing to fly over battlefields long after its creators had passed into history. The warrior culture of the Dacians extended beyond mere military technique. It was intertwined with their religious beliefs about death and immortality. A warrior who died bravely in battle went immediately to join Zalmoxis in eternal happiness. There was no greater honour, no better death. This belief made Dacian warriors fearless in ways that astonished their enemies. Ancient sources describe Dacian warriors laughing as they went into battle, singing as they faced death. They did not fear wounds or dying because they believed absolutely in the afterlife promised by their religion. This psychological advantage was enormous. An enemy who does not fear death is an enemy who cannot be intimidated, cannot be broken by threats, cannot be defeated by anything less than total destruction. The Dacians also practiced ritual preparation for battle. Warriors might fast, pray, or perform ceremonies before fighting. Priests would offer sacrifices and seek omens to determine the will of the gods. A favourable omen could inspire tremendous confidence, while an unfavourable one might delay or cancel a planned attack. Religion and warfare were inseparable in the Dacian worldview. Victory in battle brought glory, plunder, and enhanced status. Successful warriors gained reputation that translated into social advancement. They might receive gifts of gold, land, or slaves from grateful kings. Their names would be remembered and celebrated. For the nobility especially, military success was the primary path to power and prestige. Defeat brought shame, but not necessarily dishonour if the warrior had fought bravely. The Dacians respected courage above all other virtues. A man who stood his ground against overwhelming odds, who fought to the last breath, earned respect even in defeat. Cowardice, on the other hand, brought lasting disgrace. A warrior who fled from battle might find himself ostracised, stripped of status, or worse. The treatment of enemies varied depending on circumstances. Prisoners of war might be enslaved, ransomed, or sacrificed to the gods. Enemy leaders might be executed or displayed as trophies. The Dacians could be ruthless to those who opposed them, but they could also show mercy when it served their purposes. Diplomacy and alliance building were tools they used alongside military force. The Dacian military system proved effective for centuries. It allowed them to defend their mountain homeland against numerous enemies and to project power beyond their borders when opportunities arose. But it had limitations that would become apparent when facing the organised might of Rome. The loose organisation that worked well in mountain warfare struggled against Roman discipline on open ground. The reliance on individual courage could not always overcome Roman numbers and logistics. As we shall see, the Dacians would fight Rome repeatedly over several generations. They would win stunning victories and suffer devastating defeats. Their military prowess would earn them a place among Rome's most respected enemies. But ultimately, the balance of power favoured the empire with its vast resources and relentless determination. The story of that long struggle lies ahead. For now, let us leave the battlefield and turn to a new chapter in our story. We have examined the foundations of Dacian civilization, their religion, their society, their economy, and their military. Now it is time to meet the great men who shaped Dacian history. We begin with the most remarkable of them all, the king who first united the Dacian tribes into a true nation. The story of Burebista begins in a time of crisis. During the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, the Dacian tribes faced threats from multiple directions. Celtic peoples pressed from the west. Germanic tribes moved in the north. The expanding Roman Republic pushed ever closer from the south. And internally, the Dacian tribes remained divided, fighting among themselves as much as against foreign enemies. Into this chaos came Burebista, a leader whose vision and ability would transform the Dacian world. We do not know exactly when he was born or the details of his early life. Ancient sources tell us little about his origins. He may have been a noble from one of the major Dacian tribes, or he may have risen from more humble beginnings through military success. What we know for certain is that, by the middle of the 1st century, before the Common Era, he had begun the work of unifying the Dacian people. Burebista understood that the Dacians could only survive the challenges they faced if they stopped fighting each other and joined together. A single tribe, no matter how brave its warriors, could not stand against the great powers of the age. But a united Dacia, combining the strength of all the tribes, could become a force to be reckoned with. This vision of unity drove everything Burebista did. The process of unification was neither quick nor easy. Some tribes joined willingly, recognizing the wisdom of Burebista's vision. Others had to be persuaded through diplomacy, bribery, or the threat of force. Still others resisted and had to be conquered. Burebista proved equally skilled at all these approaches. He could negotiate when negotiation served his purposes. He could fight when fighting was necessary. He knew when to be generous and when to be ruthless. Burebista found a crucial ally in his work of unification. The high priest Dacian became his partner in transforming Dacian society. Dacian was a religious reformer who sought to strengthen Dacian faith and discipline. Together, the king and the priest worked to create not just a political union, but a spiritual and cultural transformation. Dacian preached a reformed version of Dacian religion that emphasized moral discipline and self-control. He convinced the Dacians to destroy their vineyards and give up wine drinking. This was a remarkable achievement in a culture known for its love of alcohol. The reform was not merely about sobriety. It was about creating a more disciplined, unified society where personal indulgence gave way to collective purpose. The religious reforms strengthened Burebista's political authority. The king was presented not just as a military leader, but as a divinely favoured ruler, carrying out the will of the gods. Dacian provided religious legitimacy for Burebista's rule, while Burebista provided political protection for Dacian's reforms. Together, they created a powerful partnership that transformed Dacian civilization. Under Burebista's leadership, the Dacian military became more organized and effective. He standardized weapons and tactics. He imposed discipline on warriors accustomed to fighting as individuals. He created a more centralized command structure that allowed for coordinated campaigns. The result was an army capable of achievements far beyond what the divided tribes had ever accomplished. With his unified kingdom and reformed army, Burebista embarked on a series of military campaigns that dramatically expanded Dacian power. He struck first against the Celtic tribes, who had long threatened Dacia from the west. The Boii and Tauriski, powerful Celtic peoples who had dominated large territories, fell before Dacian attacks. Burebista's warriors drove them from their lands, eliminating a threat that had troubled the Dacians for generations. The victories over the Celts brought Burebista's kingdom to its greatest territorial extent. At its height, his realm stretched from the middle Danube to the Black Sea, from the Carpathian Mountains to the Balkans. This was an enormous territory, larger than any Dacian ruler had ever controlled. Ancient sources suggest that Burebista could field an army of 200,000 warriors, a number that made him one of the most powerful rulers in the world at that time. Burebista did not limit his ambitions to land warfare. He recognized the importance of the Greek cities along the Black Sea coast, wealthy trading centres that controlled valuable commerce. His forces attacked and conquered several of these cities, including Olbia, a major Greek colony at the mouth of the Bug River. The Greek cities that escaped conquest were forced to acknowledge Dacian supremacy and pay tribute. The conquest of the Greek cities brought Burebista into contact with the Mediterranean world in new ways. Greek merchants, scholars, and craftsmen now lived under Dacian rule. Greek knowledge and techniques became more accessible to Dacian elites. The wealth flowing from these cities enriched the Dacian kingdom and funded further military expansion. As Burebista's power grew, he inevitably came into contact with the greatest power of the age, Rome. The Roman Republic was engaged in a devastating civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Both sides sought allies wherever they could find them. Burebista, with his huge army and strategic position, was a prize worth courting. Ancient sources tell us that Burebista entered into negotiations with Pompey, Caesar's rival. The Dacian king apparently offered military support in exchange for Roman recognition of his conquests. This alliance, if it had been fully realized, could have changed the course of history. Imagine Dacian warriors fighting alongside Roman legions in the civil war. Imagine the rewards Burebista might have claimed from a victorious Pompey. But history took a different course. Pompey was defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 before the Common Era. The alliance with Burebista never materialized into active military cooperation. Caesar emerged as the master of the Roman world, and he did not forget that Burebista had sided with his enemy. Julius Caesar began planning a major campaign against Dacia. He recognized the threat that Burebista's powerful kingdom posed to Roman interests in the Balkans. He also coveted the gold of the Carpathian Mountains. A successful conquest of Dacia would bring glory, wealth, and the elimination of a dangerous rival. Caesar gathered forces and made preparations for what would have been one of the largest military operations of his career. The campaign never happened. In March of 44, before the Common Era, Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome. The daggers of Brutus, Cassius, and their fellow conspirators ended Caesar's life and his plans for Dacian conquest. Burebista and his kingdom received an unexpected reprieve. But Burebista did not long survive his Roman enemy. In the same year that Caesar died, or possibly shortly after, Burebista himself was killed. Ancient sources suggest he was assassinated, though they provide few details about the circumstances. Some historians believe he was killed by nobles who resented his centralized power. Others suggest a palace conspiracy or a religious dispute. The truth is lost to history. The death of Burebista brought an end to the first great era of Dacian unity. His kingdom, built on his personal authority and military success, could not survive without him. The realm fragmented into 4 or 5 separate kingdoms, each ruled by a successor claiming a piece of Burebista's legacy. The great army dispersed. The conquered territories broke away. Within a generation, much of what Burebista had built had crumbled. The fragmentation of Burebista's kingdom reveals both his achievements and their limitations. He had created a unified Dacia through force of personality, military genius, and religious reform. But he had not created lasting institutions that could maintain unity without him. The kingdom was held together by loyalty to Burebista personally, not by structures that could transfer to a successor. When he died, the bonds that held the kingdom together died with him. Despite its collapse, Burebista's achievement left a lasting impact on Dacian history. He had shown what the Dacians could accomplish when united. He had demonstrated that they could defeat powerful enemies and build a great kingdom. The memory of his reign became a golden age that later generations looked back to with pride and longing. When Decebalus rose to power a century later, he would consciously model himself on Burebista, seeking to recreate the unity and glory of that earlier time. Burebista also left a physical legacy in the form of fortifications and settlements he built or improved. The fortress system in the Orashtia Mountains, which would later become the stronghold of Decebalus, may have had its origins in Burebista's reign. These mountain fortresses represented a strategic vision that would serve the Dacians well in their later struggles with Rome. The high priest Decibalus survived Burebista and continued to exercise influence over Dacian religious life. His reforms outlasted the political unity he had helped create. The strengthened priesthood remained a force in Dacian society, providing continuity even as political power fragmented. The religious foundation that Dacianus built would support Dacian resistance for generations to come. Let us pause to consider Burebista's place in history. He was one of the most remarkable leaders the ancient world produced. Starting from a divided collection of tribes, he created a kingdom that rivaled the great powers of his age. He reformed his society, transformed his military, and conquered vast territories. He dealt with Rome as an equal, negotiating with Pompey and causing Caesar to plan a major campaign against him. Few leaders from outside the Mediterranean world achieved so much. Yet Burebista remains relatively unknown compared to his contemporaries like Caesar, Pompey, or Cleopatra. This obscurity reflects the biases of historical memory. The winners write history, and Rome eventually won. Roman writers had little interest in celebrating a barbarian king who had threatened their interests. Greek writers, whose cities Burebista had conquered, had their own reasons for minimizing his achievements. The Dacians themselves left no written records to preserve their perspective. Modern scholarship has worked to recover Burebista's story from the fragments that survive. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed and expanded what ancient texts tell us. We now have a clearer picture of his kingdom's extent, his military capabilities, and his cultural achievements. Burebista is finally receiving the recognition he deserves as one of the great state builders of the ancient world. The century after Burebista's death was a time of division and weakness for the Dacian people. The successor kingdoms that emerged from his realm fought among themselves and struggled to maintain their independence. This period is poorly documented, and we know little about the individual rulers who held power. What we do know is that the Dacians never completely lost their sense of shared identity. They remembered that they had once been united and powerful. They believed they could be so again. The fragmentation of Burebista's kingdom left the Dacians vulnerable in a changing world. The Roman Republic had transformed into the Roman Empire under Augustus, who consolidated power after defeating his rivals in civil war. The new empire brought stability and organization to Roman expansion. The legions that had fought each other now turned their attention outward, to the conquest of new territories and the securing of frontiers. The Danube River became a crucial boundary in Roman strategic thinking. This great waterway, flowing from Central Europe to the Black Sea, offered a natural defensive line. Roman commanders worked to establish control over the lands south of the Danube, creating a buffer zone between the empire's heartland and the barbarian peoples to the north. The Dacians watched these developments with concern. The successor kingdoms that emerged from Burebista's realm maintained varying relationships with Rome. Some sought accommodation, trading with Roman merchants and avoiding conflict. Others continued to raid across the Danube, attacking Roman territory and carrying off plunder and slaves. These raids kept tensions high and reminded Roman commanders that the Dacian threat had not disappeared with Burebista's death. We know the names of some rulers from this period, though details about their reigns are scarce. Cotiso was a Dacian king who ruled in the decades after Burebista. He was powerful enough that Augustus considered marrying his daughter Julia to Cotiso as part of a diplomatic arrangement. The marriage never happened, but the fact that it was considered shows that Rome took Dacian power seriously, even in this period of division. Cotiso's kingdom eventually faced Roman military pressure. Augustus sent campaigns against the Dacians, seeking to punish raids and establish Roman dominance. These campaigns achieved limited success. The Romans could win battles and force temporary submissions, but they could not permanently subdue the Dacian lands north of the Danube. The mountains remained a refuge where Roman legions struggled to operate effectively. Other Dacian rulers of this period are little more than names to us. Commosicus may have been a king or perhaps a high priest who exercised political power. Carillus, Scarillo, and Durus appear in various sources as rulers of Dacian kingdoms. The relationships between these figures and the exact chronology of their reigns remain subjects of scholarly debate. What is clear is that no single ruler managed to reunite the Dacian lands during this period. The Dacians were not the only people Rome faced along the Danube frontier. Germanic tribes, Sarmatian nomads, and other groups also posed challenges. Roman policy aimed to play these various peoples against each other, preventing any single group from becoming too powerful. The Dacians sometimes found themselves caught in these diplomatic games, pressured to serve Roman interests against their neighbours. Despite political fragmentation, Dacian culture continued to develop during this period. The fortress system in the Orushti Mountains was expanded and improved. Craftsmen produced fine metalwork and pottery. Trade with the Roman world brought new goods and ideas. The Dacians absorbed influences from their contacts with Rome while maintaining their distinctive identity. Religious life remained centered on the worship of Zalmoxis and the promise of immortality. The priesthood continued to hold influence, perhaps even gaining power, as political authority fragmented. Sacred sites received ongoing attention and investment. The spiritual foundations of Dacian society remained strong, even as political structures weakened. The Romans established the province of Moesia, south of the Danube, bringing their administrative and military presence to the very edge of Dacian territory. Roman forts lined the river, watching for raids and preparing for potential invasions. Roman merchants crossed into Dacian lands, trading goods and gathering intelligence. The two worlds grew increasingly intertwined, even as they remained fundamentally opposed. Dacian raids continued to trouble the Roman frontier. Warriors would cross the frozen Danube in winter, when the ice made the river passable. They would attack Roman settlements, seize plunder, and retreat before Roman forces could respond. These raids were more than mere banditry. They were assertions of Dacian independence, refusals to accept Roman dominance, and sources of wealth that helped maintain Dacian military strength. The Romans responded with punitive expeditions that achieved temporary results but failed to solve the underlying problem. Legions would march into Dacian territory, burn villages, defeat any forces that stood against them, and then withdraw. The Dacians would wait for the Romans to leave, rebuild what had been destroyed, and resume their raids when opportunity presented itself. This cycle repeated for decades. Roman emperors grew increasingly frustrated with the Dacian situation. The raids were embarrassing, suggesting that Rome could not control its own frontiers. The Dacian gold remained tantalizingly out of reach, a prize that could fund imperial ambitions, and the example of Dacian independence might inspire other peoples to resist Roman authority. Outside, something would have to be done. The situation came to a head during the reign of Emperor Domitian. This ruler, who held power from 81 to 96 of the Common Era, faced a major Dacian challenge that would reshape the relationship between Rome and Dacia. The events of Domitian's reign set the stage for the final act of the Dacian story, the great wars that would determine the fate of the Mountain Kingdom. But before we reach those climactic events, we must meet the man who would lead the Dacians through their greatest crisis. A new king had arisen in the mountains, a leader who would reunite the Dacian people and challenge Rome as no one had since Burebista. His name was Decebalus, and his story is one of the most dramatic in all of ancient history. Decebalus emerged from the shadows of history sometime around 85 of the Common Era. We do not know his birth date, his family background, or how he rose to power. Ancient sources give us no information about his early life. He appears in the historical record, already a king, already leading his people in war against Rome. Everything we know about him comes from his years of conflict with the empire. What we can say is that Decebalus was a remarkable leader. Ancient writers, even Roman writers who had every reason to portray him negatively, acknowledged his abilities. The historian Cassius Dio, writing a century after Decebalus's death, described him as shrewd in understanding warfare and skilled in its conduct. He knew when to attack and when to retreat. He could inspire his followers and intimidate his enemies. He was, in short, exactly the kind of leader the Dacians needed in their hour of greatest danger. Decebalus came to power at a critical moment. The divided Dacian kingdoms had weakened the people's ability to resist Roman pressure. The Romans had grown stronger and more aggressive under Domitian. The balance of power that had allowed the Dacians to maintain their independence was shifting against them. Only a leader of exceptional ability could hope to reverse this trend. The new king set about reunifying the Dacian tribes with energy and determination. Like Burebista before him, he understood that only a united Dacia could face the Roman threat. He used diplomacy, marriage alliances, and military force to bring the various kingdoms under his authority. The process took time, but Decebalus proved patient when patience served his purposes, and decisive when action was required. Decebalus also worked to strengthen Dacian military capabilities. He improved the fortress system in the Oresti Mountains, creating a network of strongholds that could support each other and resist Roman siege techniques. He standardized weapons and tactics. He sought allies among other peoples who feared Rome, including Sarmatian nomads and Germanic tribes. He even hired Roman deserters and renegades who could teach his warriors Roman techniques and reveal Roman weaknesses. The capital of Decebalus's kingdom was Sarmizegetusa Regia, the sacred city in the Oresti Mountains. This was not the same as the later Roman city of Sarmizegetusa, which was built in a different location after the conquest. Decebalus's Sarmizegetusa was a mountain fortress and religious centre, perched high in the peaks where Roman legions would struggle to reach it. Sarmizegetusa Regia was both a political capital and a spiritual heart. Here stood the great sanctuaries where priests communed with Zalmoxis. Here the king held court and received ambassadors. Here the treasures of Dacia were stored, the gold and silver accumulated over generations. The city represented everything the Dacians were fighting to preserve: their independence, their religion, their identity as a people. The fortress system surrounding Sarmizegetusa Regia was a marvel of military engineering. Multiple strongholds occupied strategic positions in the mountains, controlling passes and valleys. These fortresses were built with the murus dassicus technique, their walls strong enough to resist Roman siege engines. They were stocked with supplies for long sieges. They were connected by roads that allowed rapid movement of troops and messages. The most important of these fortresses included Kostești, Blidaru, Piatra Roșie, and Capulna. Each occupied a commanding position with excellent fields of view and fire. Each could hold out independently while supporting its neighbours. Together, they formed a defensive system that would cost any attacker dearly. Decebalus had learned from Rome's successes and built defences designed specifically to counter Roman tactics. Decebalus understood that military strength alone would not be enough. He needed diplomatic support to balance Roman power. He reached out to peoples beyond Roman control, seeking allies who shared his interest in resisting Roman expansion. The Sarmatians, nomadic warriors from the steppes, became important partners. Their cavalry could supplement Dacian infantry and threaten Roman flanks. The king also cultivated relationships with Germanic tribes who lived beyond the Roman frontier. These peoples had their own grievances against Rome and their own reasons to support Dacian resistance. An alliance of all Rome's northern enemies could potentially overwhelm even the mighty legions. Decebalus worked toward this goal, though he never fully achieved it. Within his kingdom, Decebalus maintained power through a combination of military success, religious legitimacy, and political skill. He rewarded loyal followers with gold, land, and honour. He punished traitors and rivals without mercy. He presented himself as the champion of Dacian independence, the heir to Burebista's legacy, the defender of Zalmoxis' people. These claims resonated with the population that remembered past glory and resented Roman pressure. The relationship between Decebalus and the Dacian priesthood remains somewhat unclear. The high priest still held significant influence, as he had since the time of Dacianus. Decebalus needed priestly support to legitimize his rule and maintain popular loyalty. At the same time, he could not allow religious authority to overshadow his own political power. The balance between king and priest was delicate, and we cannot know exactly how Decebalus managed it. What we can say is that Dacian religion remained strong under Decebalus's rule. The sanctuaries at Sarmizegetusa Regia continued to function. Priests continued to perform their rituals and maintain their traditions. The belief in Zalmoxis and immortality continued to inspire Dacian warriors. Whatever tensions may have existed between political and religious authority, they did not prevent effective cooperation against the common Roman enemy. Decebalus was also a pragmatic leader willing to adopt useful innovations regardless of their source. He brought Roman engineers and craftsmen to Dacia, using their skills to improve fortifications and weapons. He studied Roman tactics and developed counters to them. He was not blindly traditional, clinging to old ways simply because they were old. He was a modernizer who sought every advantage in the coming struggle. The king's personality comes through only dimly in ancient sources, but certain traits are clear. He was brave, willing to lead his warriors in battle rather than commanding from safety. He was cunning, capable of deception and misdirection when they served his purposes. He was proud, unwilling to accept subordination to Rome even when resistance seemed hopeless. And he was determined, fighting on through defeats that would have broken lesser men. Decebalus inspired fierce loyalty among his followers. Warriors who served him remained faithful through years of war, through victories and defeats, through hope and despair. This loyalty was not merely the product of fear or obligation. It reflected genuine admiration for a leader who embodied the best qualities of the Dacian warrior tradition. Decebalus asked nothing of his men that he was not willing to give himself. He shared their dangers, their hardships, and their sacrifices. In return, they gave him everything they had. The nobles who served under Decebalus formed a tight-knit group bound by shared purpose and mutual trust. These men commanded the warriors of their own regions and tribes, but they subordinated themselves to the king's overall strategy. This unity of command gave the Dacians a significant advantage over their earlier, more fragmented state. Decebalus could coordinate operations across his entire kingdom, concentrating forces where they were needed and responding quickly to Roman moves. Among these nobles, certain names have come down to us through ancient sources. Vecinus was a trusted commander who led important military operations. Bacillus was another noble who played a significant role in Dacian resistance. Diegis, who may have been Decebalus's brother, served as a diplomat and military leader. These men and others like them formed the inner circle of Dacian leadership, advising the king and executing his plans. The common warriors who filled the ranks of Decebalus's army came from villages throughout Dacia. They were farmers, herders, and craftsmen who took up arms when their king called. They fought for their families, their land, their gods, and their freedom. The belief in Zalmoxis gave them courage that amazed their enemies. They went into battle singing, laughing at death, confident that fallen warriors would rise to eternal happiness. Decebalus understood how to use this religious fervour without being controlled by it. He was practical enough to retreat when necessary, to negotiate when fighting was hopeless, to accept temporary setbacks in pursuit of long-term goals. Not every battle needed to be fought to the death. Sometimes survival was more important than glory. This combination of inspiring leadership and practical calculation made Decebalus a formidable opponent. The king also showed skill in dealing with the civilian population of his realm. He needed their support to sustain his military efforts. Farmers had to produce food for the army. Craftsmen had to make weapons and equipment. Miners had to extract the gold that funded diplomacy and paid for mercenaries. Decebalus maintained this support through a combination of patriotic appeal, religious sanction, and practical governance. We should not romanticize Decebalus or imagine him as a modern democratic leader. He was an ancient king who ruled through personal authority backed by force. He could be ruthless when ruthlessness served his purposes. He executed traitors, punished failures, and demanded absolute obedience. The Dacian kingdom under his rule was not a gentle place, but it was an effective place, capable of resisting the greatest military power the world had ever seen. As Decebalus consolidated his power and prepared his kingdom for war, events in the wider world moved toward confrontation. The Roman Empire under Domitian was aggressive and ambitious. The emperor sought military glory to enhance his prestige. The Danube frontier offered opportunities for conquest that could satisfy this ambition, and the wealth of Dacia, especially its gold, beckoned to an empire always hungry for precious metals. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic conflicts of the ancient world. On one side stood Rome, with its professional legions, its vast resources, and its centuries of military experience. On the other stood Dacia, with its mountain fortresses, its fearless warriors, and a king who would rather die than submit. The clash between these two powers would determine the fate of the Carpathian Mountains and their people. The war between Rome and Dacia under Emperor Domitian began with Dacian aggression. In the winter of 85 to 86 of the Common Era, Dacian forces crossed the frozen Danube River and invaded the Roman province of Moesia. This was not a simple raid for plunder. It was a major military operation aimed at destroying Roman power in the region. The invasion caught the Romans off guard. Oppius Sabinus, the governor of Moesia, gathered what forces he could and marched to meet the Dacian threat. The resulting battle was a disaster for Rome. Sabinus was killed and his army was destroyed. The Dacians captured Roman military standards, the eagles that symbolized legionary honor. This was a humiliation that Rome could not ignore. The loss of Sabinus and his army shocked the Roman world. Defeats on this scale were rare for the legions. The Dacians had proven themselves capable of destroying Roman forces in open battle, not just harassing them with raids. Emperor Domitian recognized the seriousness of the situation and responded with massive force. Domitian himself travelled to Moesia to oversee the Roman response. He brought reinforcements from other parts of the empire, assembling an army capable of crushing the Dacian threat. The emperor did not personally command in battle, leaving that task to his generals, but his presence demonstrated Rome's commitment to avenging the defeat. The first major Roman counteroffensive was led by Cornelius Fuscus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Fuscus was an experienced commander who'd served Domitian loyally. The emperor entrusted him with a large army and orders to invade Dacia and punish Decebalus for his aggression. In 86 of the Common Era, Fuscus crossed the Danube and marched into Dacian territory. The campaign began well enough. Fuscus advanced into Dacia without meeting serious resistance. Decebalus, following his usual strategy, avoided pitched battle and withdrew into the mountains. He was drawing the Romans deeper into territory where their advantages of discipline and numbers would count for less. The mountain passes and dense forests favoured defenders who knew the terrain. Fuscus pursued the retreating Dacians, perhaps overconfident after his initial success. He led his army into the mountains, seeking the decisive battle that would end the war. Decebalus gave him that battle, but not in the way Fuscus expected. At a place the Romans later called Tapae, the Dacians turned and fought. The first battle of Tapae was a catastrophe for Rome. The Dacians had chosen their ground carefully, a mountain pass where Roman formations could not deploy properly. Decebalus sprung his trap with devastating effect. The Roman army was caught in terrain that negated their tactical advantages. Dacian warriors swarmed down from the heights, their faces cutting through Roman armour. Cornelius Fuscus died in the battle, killed by the warriors he had come to conquer. His army was destroyed, suffering losses comparable to the earlier defeat of Sabinus. Worst of all, the Dacians captured another legionary eagle, the standard of the 5th Legion Alaudi. 2 eagles lost in a single year was an almost unprecedented disgrace for Roman arms. The capture of the legionary eagles was more than a military setback. It was a profound symbolic blow to Roman prestige. The eagle was sacred to the legions, representing their honour and their connection to the gods. Losing an eagle brought shame that could only be erased by recovering the standard or destroying the enemy who held it. Decebalus now possessed 2 of these precious symbols, trophies that proclaimed his victories to all the world. Domitian was furious at the defeats but recognised that he needed a new approach. The aggressive strategy of direct invasion had failed twice, costing Rome 2 armies and 2 generals. The emperor appointed a new commander, Tetius Julianus, and gave him orders to proceed more carefully. Julianus would prove more cautious and more successful than his predecessor. Tetius Julianus rebuilt Roman forces in Moesia and prepared for a new campaign. He studied the earlier defeats and developed tactics better suited to mountain warfare. He would not rush blindly into Dacian traps. He would advance methodically, securing his supply lines and maintaining discipline. When he finally brought Decebalus to battle, he would do so on terms more favourable to Roman arms. The renewed Roman offensive came in 88 of the Common Era. Julianus crossed the Danube with a powerful army and advanced into Dacia. This time, the Romans moved more carefully, avoiding the mistakes that had doomed Fuscus. Julianus kept his forces concentrated and maintained constant vigilance against ambush. Decebalus recognised that he could not simply repeat his earlier tactics. The Romans had learned from their defeats and would not fall into the same traps. He would have to fight a different kind of war. The Dacian king gathered his forces and prepared to meet the Roman invasion with a major battle. The Second Battle of Tapae took place near the site of the earlier Roman disaster. This time, however, the outcome was different. Julianus had chosen his ground more carefully and deployed his forces more effectively. The battle was hard fought, with heavy casualties on both sides, but the Romans emerged victorious. Dacian resistance was broken, and Decebalus was forced to retreat deeper into the mountains. The Roman victory at Second Tapae opened the road to the Dacian heartland. Julianus could now advance towards Sarmizegetusa Regia and potentially end the war with a decisive stroke. Decebalus faced the prospect of total defeat. His army was weakened, his allies were wavering, and the Romans were pressing forward relentlessly. At this critical moment, events far from Dacia intervened to save Decebalus. On the empire's other frontiers, new threats were emerging that demanded Roman attention. Germanic tribes were causing trouble along the Rhine. The Sarmatians were raiding across the Danube in other sectors, and within the empire itself a rebellion was brewing that would soon demand Domitian's full attention. The emperor faced a difficult choice. He could continue the Dacian war and risk losing control of other frontiers, or he could make peace with Decebalus and free his forces to deal with more pressing threats. Domitian chose peace, a decision that would prove controversial both at the time and in historical memory. The peace treaty between Rome and Dacia was remarkable for its terms. Decebalus agreed to become a client king, technically subordinate to Rome. He returned the Roman prisoners and some of the captured military equipment. In exchange, Rome agreed to pay Decebalus annual subsidies and to provide technical assistance, including engineers and craftsmen who could help improve Dacian defences. The treaty was widely criticised in Rome. Many saw it as a disgraceful surrender, a reward for Dacian aggression rather than punishment for it. The subsidies looked like tribute, money paid by the mighty Roman Empire to a barbarian king. The provision of Roman engineers seemed like madness, helping an enemy prepare for future wars. Domitian's reputation suffered from the peace he had made. From Decebalus's perspective, the treaty was a triumph. He had fought Rome to a standstill and extracted concessions that enhanced his power. The subsidies provided money to maintain his army and reward his followers. The Roman engineers helped strengthen his fortresses, and he still held at least one of the captured legionary eagles, a trophy that proclaimed his victories. The peace held for over a decade, but it was never stable. Both sides knew that the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. Rome had not abandoned its ambitions in Dacia, and Decebalus had not accepted permanent subordination to the empire. The treaty was a truce, not a settlement. Sooner or later, war would resume. Decebalus used the years of peace wisely. He strengthened his fortifications, improved his army, and cultivated alliances with other peoples who feared Rome. He knew that the Romans would return eventually, and he intended to be ready when they did. The subsidies Rome paid him funded these preparations, an irony that Roman critics of the treaty noted bitterly. The Roman engineers who came to Dacia as part of the treaty proved especially valuable. They taught the Dacians advanced construction techniques and helped improve the fortress system. Some of these engineers may have been willing collaborators, deserters, or adventurers who found better opportunities in Dacia than in Rome. Others were probably prisoners or hostages forced to share their knowledge. Either way, their expertise strengthened Dacian defences. Emperor Domitian was assassinated in 96 of the Common Era, ending his controversial reign. His successors, Nerva and then Trajan, inherited the Dacian problem along with the rest of the empire. The peace treaty remained in effect, but tensions continued to build. Dacian raids resumed, testing Roman patience. The annual subsidies grated on Roman pride, and the captured legionary eagles remained in Dacian hands, a constant reminder of past humiliations. Trajan, who became emperor in 98 of the Common Era, was a military man determined to restore Roman honour. He had no intention of continuing the policy of paying tribute to Decebalus. Instead, he began planning the complete conquest of Dacia, a campaign that would settle the Dacian question once and for all. The final act of the Dacian story was about to begin. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, known to history as Trajan, was one of the greatest military emperors Rome ever produced. Born in the province of Hispania, he rose through the ranks on merit, proving himself as a soldier and commander before being adopted by the elderly emperor Nerva. When Nerva died in 98, Trajan inherited an empire and immediately began planning its expansion. Trajan's reasons for attacking Dacia were multiple and reinforcing. First, there was the matter of honour. The defeats under Domitian and the humiliating peace treaty demanded vengeance. The captured legionary eagles had to be recovered, and Dacian arrogance had to be punished. A successful war would demonstrate that Rome remained the supreme military power and that defiance of the empire brought destruction. Second, there was the matter of wealth. Dacian gold was legendary throughout the ancient world. The Carpathian Mountains contained deposits that could fund imperial ambitions for generations. Trajan needed money for his building projects, his military campaigns, and the donatives that kept the army loyal. Dacian treasure could provide all of this and more. Third, there was the matter of strategy. Dacia occupied a position that threatened Roman control of the Danube frontier. As long as Decebalus remained independent, he could raid Roman territory, support Rome's enemies, and destabilize the entire region. Conquering Dacia would eliminate this threat and create a more defensible frontier. Finally, there was the matter of personal glory. Trajan was an ambitious man who sought to be remembered as one of Rome's greatest emperors. Military conquest was the surest path to such glory. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Augustus had all built their reputations on military success. Trajan intended to join their ranks, and Dacia offered the opportunity. The preparations for war were extensive and thorough. Trajan gathered forces from across the empire, assembling one of the largest armies Rome had fielded in generations. Estimates suggest he commanded between 100,000 and 150,000 men, including legionaries, auxiliary troops, and allied forces. This massive army required enormous logistical support, which Trajan organised with characteristic efficiency. The emperor also prepared the diplomatic ground for his campaign. He sought to isolate Decebalus by neutralising potential allies. Roman diplomats worked to keep the Germanic tribes quiet. Agreements were reached with Sarmatian groups to prevent them from supporting Dacia. Trajan wanted to face Decebalus alone, without interference from other enemies. In the spring of 101, Trajan launched his invasion. The Roman army crossed the Danube on a bridge of boats and advanced into Dacian territory. Unlike the hasty campaigns of Domitian's reign, this invasion was carefully planned and methodically executed. Trajan intended to crush Dacian resistance systematically, leaving no stronghold untaken and no army undefeated. Decebalus faced this invasion with the resources he had spent years accumulating. His fortresses were stronger than ever, improved with the help of Roman engineers. His army was well equipped and motivated. His alliances, though weakened by Roman diplomacy, still provided some support. But the sheer scale of Trajan's invasion was unprecedented. The Dacian king was facing the full might of the Roman Empire. The initial Roman advance met fierce resistance. Dacian forces contested every river crossing, every mountain pass, every defensible position. The falx-wielding warriors proved as deadly as ever, and Roman casualties mounted. But Trajan pressed forward relentlessly, accepting losses that would have deterred lesser commanders. He was determined to reach the Dacian heartland regardless of the cost. The decisive battle of the first campaign came at Tapai, the same location that had seen Roman defeats and victories in earlier years. This third Battle of Tapai was the largest engagement of the war, pitting the main Roman army against the bulk of Dacian forces. The fighting was intense and bloody, lasting for hours as both sides committed their full strength. The Romans won the Battle of Tapai, but it was not an easy victory. Dacian resistance was so fierce that Trajan himself was reportedly forced to tear up his own clothing to provide bandages for wounded soldiers. The medical supplies had run out, a testament to the intensity of the fighting. Roman losses were heavy enough that Trajan paused his advance to rest and reorganize his forces. The victory at Tapai broke the main Dacian field army, but did not end the war. Decebalus retreated into the mountains, where his fortresses offered continued resistance. The Roman army followed, beginning the laborious process of besieging and capturing each stronghold. This mountain warfare was slow, costly, and frustrating, exactly the kind of fighting the Dacians excelled at. As the campaign season of 101 drew to a close, Trajan had made significant progress, but had not achieved decisive victory. His army occupied much of lowland Dacia and had captured several important fortresses. But Decebalus still held the mountain strongholds, including Sarmizegetusa Regia. The war would have to continue into the following year. The winter of 101 to 102 brought a pause in major operations, but not an end to the conflict. Both sides used the time to rest, reorganize, and prepare for renewed fighting. Trajan brought up reinforcements and supplies. Decebalus sought to rally his remaining forces and strengthen his defences. The outcome of the war remained uncertain. When campaigning resumed in 102, Trajan adopted a multi-pronged strategy. Roman columns advanced from different directions, stretching Dacian defences and preventing Decebalus from concentrating his forces. This approach was risky, as it divided Roman strength, but it proved effective against an enemy who was already weakened and outnumbered. The Roman columns converged on the Orishti mountains, the heart of Dacian power. One by one, the great fortresses fell to Roman sieges. The Murus Dacicus walls, that had seemed impregnable, were breached by Roman engineering and Roman persistence. Kostest, Blidaru, Pietrarosia, and the other strongholds that had guarded Sarmisegetusa, Regia, were captured or abandoned. Decebalus watched his defensive system crumble with growing desperation. His allies had failed to provide meaningful support. His army was too weakened to risk another major battle. His fortresses, despite their strength, could not hold indefinitely against Roman siege techniques. The king faced a terrible choice between continued resistance that would likely end in total destruction and submission that would end Dacian independence. In the end, Decebalus chose submission, at least temporarily. He sent envoys to Trajan seeking peace terms. The king himself came to the Roman camp and performed the ritual of surrender, kneeling before the emperor and accepting Roman supremacy. It was a humiliating moment for the proud Dacian ruler, but it preserved his life and his kingdom. The peace terms of 102 were harsh but not annihilating. Decebalus had to surrender all Roman deserters and prisoners. He had to hand over his siege engines and artillery. He had to demolish his fortifications and accept Roman garrisons in his territory. He had to give up the captured legionary eagles, finally returning these symbols of Roman honour. And he had to accept the status of a client king, subordinate to Rome in all matters of foreign policy. Trajan celebrated his victory with a triumph in Rome, the traditional ceremony honouring a conquering general. The captured Dacian treasures were displayed in the procession, along with Dacian prisoners and representations of the conquered fortresses. The Roman people cheered their emperor's success. Trajan took the title Dacicus, meaning conqueror of Dacia, adding it to his imperial name. The Peace of 102 was supposed to end the Dacian threat permanently. Decebalus was now a Roman client, bound by treaty to obey imperial commands. His military power was supposedly broken, his fortresses demolished, his weapons surrendered. Rome had won, or so it seemed, but Decebalus had no intention of accepting permanent subordination. Even as he knelt before Trajan and agreed to peace terms, he was planning his next move. The Dacian king was playing for time, hoping to rebuild his strength and find new allies. The peace was merely an intermission in a conflict that would soon resume with even greater fury. The years between Trajan's two Dacian wars, from 102 to 105 of the Common Era, were a time of deceptive calm. On the surface, the peace held. Decebalus remained on his throne, technically a Roman client. Roman garrisons occupied positions in Dacia, watching for signs of trouble. Trade and diplomacy continued, as if the war had truly ended. Beneath this surface, however, both sides were preparing for renewed conflict. Decebalus had accepted the peace terms under duress, and he had no intention of honouring them permanently. As soon as Roman attention turned elsewhere, he began rebuilding what he had been forced to surrender. The fortifications that Decebalus had agreed to demolish were quietly reconstructed. Workers laboured in the mountains, rebuilding walls and strengthening defences. The work was done carefully, hidden from Roman observers as much as possible. Decebalus knew that discovery would bring immediate Roman retaliation, but he judged the risk worthwhile. Without strong fortresses, Dacia could not resist future Roman attacks. The weapons and siege engines that Decebalus had surrendered were replaced through new production and secret purchases. Dacian smiths forged new falxes and spears, craftsmen built new artillery pieces, merchants smuggled military supplies into Dacia from beyond Roman control. The Dacian army was being rebuilt, soldier by soldier and weapon by weapon. Decebalus also renewed his diplomatic efforts, seeking allies who could help balance Roman power. He sent envoys to the Sarmatians, the Germanic tribes, and other peoples who had reason to fear Rome. He offered gold, promises of mutual support, and appeals to shared interest in resisting Roman expansion. Some of these efforts bore fruit, though the alliances remained fragile and unreliable. Most dangerously, Decebalus attempted to recruit Roman enemies from within the empire itself. He made contact with disaffected Roman officers and officials, offering rewards for those who would betray their emperor. He harboured Roman deserters who brought military knowledge and sometimes military equipment. These activities, if discovered, would give Trajan perfect justification for renewed war. The Romans were not unaware of Dacian activities. Spies and informants reported on Decebalus's preparations. Roman commanders in the region sent warnings to the emperor. The garrisons in Dacia observed suspicious activities and passed along their concerns. Trajan knew that Decebalus was violating the peace treaty, but he bided his time, waiting for the right moment to act. Trajan had his own reasons for delay. The First Dacian War had been costly, and the empire needed time to recover. Other frontiers required attention. Administrative reforms demanded the emperor's focus, and Trajan wanted to be certain of victory when he struck again. The next war would be a war of annihilation, not just punishment. He would not leave Decebalus on his throne a second time. The breaking point came in 105 of the Common Era. Roman intelligence discovered that Decebalus had been negotiating with Parthia, Rome's great rival in the east. The Dacian king was apparently seeking a grand alliance against Rome, uniting all the empire's enemies in a coordinated assault. This was intolerable. Trajan could not allow such an alliance to form. There were other provocations as well. Decebalus had allegedly attempted to have Trajan assassinated, sending agents to kill the emperor. Roman deserters continued to find refuge in Dacia. The rebuilt fortifications were now too obvious to ignore, and Decebalus had reportedly attacked and defeated a Roman ally, the Zalmoxis, who had sided with Rome during the First War. Trajan presented these violations to the Roman Senate and received authorization for renewed war. This time, there would be no negotiated peace, no client kingdom, no second chances. The war would end only with the complete destruction of the Dacian kingdom and the death or capture of Decebalus. Rome would settle the Dacian question permanently. The Second Dacian War began in the summer of 105 with a Roman invasion even larger than the first. Trajan had assembled massive forces, drawing legions from across the empire. The army that crossed the Danube numbered well over 100,000 men, supported by an enormous logistical apparatus. This was not merely a punitive expedition. It was a war of conquest aimed at erasing Dacia from the map. Trajan's strategy for the Second War differed from the first. Instead of a single main thrust, he launched multiple columns that advanced from different directions. This approach prevented Decebalus from concentrating his forces and forced the Dacians to defend everywhere at once. The rebuilt fortresses that Decebalus had counted on were bypassed or besieged simultaneously. The Romans also employed a remarkable feat of engineering to support their invasion. Trajan's architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, designed and built a permanent bridge across the Danube River. This bridge, one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world, spanned over a kilometre of water. It allowed Roman forces and supplies to cross the Danube easily. eliminating one of the major obstacles to invasion. The bridge was a statement of Roman power as much as a practical military asset. It declared that Rome intended to stay in Dacia permanently. The Danube, which had served as a barrier protecting Dacia for centuries, was now merely a road for Roman legions. Decebalus could see his doom approaching across that bridge. Dacian resistance in the Second War was fierce but ultimately hopeless. Decebalus and his warriors fought with the courage of desperation, knowing that defeat meant the end of everything they held dear. Every fortress was defended to the last. Every pass was contested. Every Roman advance was paid for in blood. The Dacian falks remained deadly, and Roman casualties mounted steadily. Trajan soldiers learned to respect and fear the curved blade that could split helmets and sever limbs. But Roman numbers, Roman discipline, and Roman persistence gradually wore down Dacian resistance. Fortress after fortress fell. The defensive perimeter around Sarmizegetusa Regia contracted steadily. The siege of Sarmizegetusa Regia was the climax of the war. This sacred capital, the spiritual and political heart of Dacia, was the ultimate prize. Decebalus had concentrated his remaining forces there, determined to make a final stand. The fortifications were the strongest in Dacia, and the defenders were motivated by religious fervour and patriotic desperation. The Romans approached the siege methodically. They surrounded the city, cutting off any hope of relief or escape. They built siege works and brought up artillery. They probed the defences, looking for weaknesses, and they waited, knowing that time was on their side. The defenders could not hold out forever. The fall of Sarmizegetusa Regia came through a combination of assault and treachery. Roman forces breached the walls after fierce fighting. Some accounts suggest that traitors within the city helped the Romans find weak points in the defences. However it happened, the sacred capital fell to the invaders. The sanctuaries of Zalmoxis were desecrated. The treasures of Dacia were seized. The heart of the Dacian kingdom stopped beating. But Decebalus was not in the city when it fell. The king had escaped before the final assault, fleeing into the mountains with a small group of loyal followers. He still hoped to continue resistance, to rally survivors, perhaps to find refuge beyond Roman reach. Trajan was determined not to let him escape. Roman cavalry pursued Decebalus through the mountains. The chase covered difficult terrain, through forests and over ridges, as the Dacian king sought to evade his hunters. Decebalus knew the mountains intimately, but the Romans were relentless. They followed his trail, closing in day by day. The end came in a mountain clearing, where Roman cavalry finally cornered the Dacian king. Decebalus faced a choice between capture and death. Capture would mean being taken to Rome in chains, displayed in Trajan's triumph, and then executed as a defeated enemy. It would mean the ultimate humiliation for a king who had defied Rome for 20 years. Decebalus chose death. As the Roman horsemen closed in, the king drew his curved Dacian blade and cut his own throat. He died as he had lived, proud and defiant, refusing to give his enemies the satisfaction of taking him alive. The last great king of Dacia fell in the mountains he had defended so long. A Roman cavalryman named Tiberius Claudius Maximus reached Decebalus just as the king died. He took the severed head and the right hand of Decebalus as trophies, proof that the Dacian king was truly dead. These grim relics were sent to Trajan, who displayed them before his army. The war was over. Dacia had fallen. The scene of Decebalus's death was later immortalized on Trajan's column in Rome. The carved relief shows the Dacian king on his knees, his sword at his throat, as Roman cavalry surrounds him. It is one of the most famous images from ancient art, a moment of tragedy and defiance frozen in stone. Even Roman artists could not help but convey a certain respect for the enemy who had fought so hard and died so bravely. The death of Decebalus did not immediately end all resistance. Some Dacian warriors continued fighting in isolated pockets, refusing to surrender even after their king was dead. The Romans hunted these holdouts systematically, determined to eliminate any possibility of future rebellion. The process took months, but eventually all organised resistance ceased. The aftermath of the conquest was brutal. The Romans showed little mercy to a people who had defied them so long and cost them so much. Mass executions eliminated Dacian nobles who might lead future rebellions. Enslavement removed much of the surviving population. The Dacian upper class was essentially destroyed, its members killed, enslaved, or scattered. The treasures of Dacia were seized and sent to Rome. The gold and silver accumulated over generations filled Roman coffers. Ancient sources suggest that the Dacian treasure was enormous, enough to fund Trajan's ambitious building programs for years. The Forum of Trajan, Trajan's Column, and other monuments were built with Dacian gold. The wealth of the conquered kingdom transformed the imperial capital. Trajan celebrated his victory with games and spectacles on an unprecedented scale. The celebrations reportedly lasted for 123 days and involved 11,000 animals and 10,000 gladiators. Dacian prisoners fought and died in the arena for Roman entertainment. The triumph of Rome was complete, displayed in blood and spectacle for all to see. With the conquest complete, Trajan organised the former Dacian kingdom as a Roman province. The new province of Dacia occupied much of the territory that Decebalus had ruled, though some peripheral areas were left outside direct Roman control. The province was strategically important, extending Roman power north of the Danube and providing a buffer against barbarian peoples beyond. The administration of Roman Dacia followed standard provincial patterns. A governor appointed by the emperor oversaw civil and military affairs. Roman law replaced Dacian custom. Latin became the language of administration and eventually of daily life. The apparatus of Roman rule, with its taxes, courts, and bureaucracy, was imposed on the conquered territory. The Romans established a new capital for the province, also called Sarmizegetusa, but located in a different place from Decebalus's mountain stronghold. This Colonia Ulpia Traiana Augusta Dacica Sarmizegetusa, to give its full name, was built on more accessible terrain suitable for a Roman city. It became the administrative, economic, and cultural centre of the new province. Other Roman cities rose across Dacia. Apulum, Napoca, Porolissum, and Drobeta became important urban centres. These cities featured the standard elements of Roman urban life: forums, temples, baths, amphitheatres, and aqueducts. Roman architecture transformed the Dacian landscape, replacing wooden structures with stone buildings in Mediterranean styles. The Roman military maintained a strong presence in Dacia throughout the provincial period. Legions were stationed permanently in the province, ready to defend against external threats and suppress internal unrest. Auxiliary units patrolled the frontiers and garrisoned smaller posts. The military presence was both a defence against barbarians and a reminder to the local population of Roman power. The population of Roman Dacia was transformed by the conquest. Many native Dacians had been killed or enslaved during the wars. Those who remained were joined by settlers from across the Roman Empire. Veterans received land grants in Dacia, establishing farms and families. Merchants, craftsmen, and adventurers came seeking opportunities in the new province. The result was a mixed population that gradually blended into a new provincial identity. The process of Romanization proceeded rapidly in Dacia. The native Dacian language disappeared within a few generations, replaced by Latin. Dacian religious practices faded as Roman and Greek gods took their place. Dacian dress, customs, and social structures gave way to Roman equivalents. Within a century of the conquest, Dacia had become thoroughly Roman in culture, if not in blood. This rapid Romanization has puzzled historians. Other conquered peoples maintained their languages and identities for centuries under Roman rule. Why did the Dacians assimilate so quickly and completely? Several factors may explain this phenomenon. The destruction of the Dacian elite during the conquest removed the class most likely to preserve traditional culture. Nobles, priests, and educated people who might have maintained Dacian identity were killed, enslaved, or driven into exile. Without this leadership, the common people had no one to organize cultural resistance. The heavy influx of settlers from other provinces diluted the native population. In some areas, newcomers may have outnumbered the surviving Dacians. These settlers brought Latin as their common language, since they came from different parts of the empire and needed a shared tongue. The Dacians who remained found it practical to learn Latin for economic and social advancement. The benefits of Roman citizenship also encouraged assimilation. Roman citizens enjoyed legal privileges and economic opportunities denied to non-citizens. Dacians who adopted Roman ways, learned Latin, and demonstrated loyalty could eventually gain citizenship for themselves and their descendants. This created powerful incentives for abandoning traditional Dacian identity. The destruction of Dacian religious institutions was particularly significant. The priesthood that had maintained Dacian spiritual traditions was eliminated. The sanctuaries were destroyed or abandoned. The worship of Zalmoxis ceased, replaced by the gods of Rome. Without their religion, the Dacians lost the spiritual foundation that had defined their identity for centuries. Roman Dacia prospered economically during the provincial period. The gold mines that had attracted Roman attention continued to produce wealth, now flowing to imperial coffers rather than Dacian kings. Agriculture flourished in the fertile valleys. Trade connected Dacia to the wider Roman economy. Cities grew and multiplied. The province became a valuable part of the empire. The gold mines of Dacia deserved special attention from Roman administrators. These mines, located primarily in the Apusini Mountains, were among the most productive in the empire. The Romans expanded mining operations, bringing in skilled workers and advanced techniques. The gold extracted from Dacian mountains funded imperial projects across the Mediterranean world. Mining communities developed around the major extraction sites. Alburnus Maia, modern Rocia-Montana, became one of the most important mining centres. Archaeological discoveries at this site have revealed wax tablets, preserving contracts, legal documents, and personal records from the Roman period. These tablets provide remarkable insights into daily life in a Roman mining community. The tablets show a diverse population working the mines. Workers came from many parts of the empire, including Dalmatia, Pannonia, and even distant provinces. They lived in a community governed by Roman law, conducting business, settling disputes, and recording their transactions in Latin. The mines created a cosmopolitan environment where people from different backgrounds worked and lived together. Agriculture remained the foundation of the provincial economy for most inhabitants. The fertile plains and valleys of Dacia supported extensive farming. Wheat, barley, and other grains fed the population and provided surpluses for export. Vineyards produced wine, reversing the prohibition that Burebista and Decebalus had imposed centuries earlier. Orchards yielded fruits. Livestock grazed on pastures and hillsides. Roman agricultural techniques improved productivity. Iron tools became more widely available. Irrigation systems brought water to fields that had previously depended on rainfall. New crop varieties were introduced from other parts of the empire. The result was increased food production that supported population growth and urban development. Trade routes connected Dacia to markets throughout the Roman world. Roads built by the legions facilitated the movement of goods and people. The Danube River served as a major commercial artery, carrying products to and from the Black Sea. Dacian exports included grain, livestock, hides, timber, and of course gold. Imports brought Mediterranean luxuries, manufactured goods, and products from distant provinces. The cities of Roman Dacia became centres of commerce, craftsmanship, and culture. Urban populations engaged in manufacturing, trade, and services. Potters, metalworkers, weavers, and other craftsmen produced goods for local consumption and export. Merchants operated shops and trading houses. Professionals, including doctors, lawyers, and teachers, served urban populations. Roman religious practices took root in Dacia, alongside traditional cults from other parts of the empire. Temples to Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, and other Roman deities rose in every city. Mystery religions from the eastern Mediterranean, including the cults of Mithras, Isis, and Cybele, attracted followers among soldiers and civilians. Christianity would eventually reach Dacia as well, though its spread belongs to a later chapter of history. The cult of Mithras was particularly popular among soldiers stationed in Dacia. Mithraea, the underground temples where Mithric rituals took place, have been discovered at military sites throughout the province. The religion's emphasis on loyalty, courage, and brotherhood appealed to military men far from home. Mithric imagery, including the famous scene of Mithras slaying the bull, appears frequently in Dacian archaeological finds. Education in Roman Dacia followed patterns established elsewhere in the empire. Children of wealthy families received instruction in Latin grammar, rhetoric, and literature. Schools prepared young men for careers in administration, law, and other professions. The educated elite of the province could quote Virgil and Cicero, participate in literary culture, and correspond with peers across the Roman world. The common people received less formal education, but still acquired practical literacy for business and daily life. Inscriptions, graffiti, and documents show that basic reading and writing were widespread. Even miners and craftsmen could sign contracts and keep simple records. Latin literacy became a normal part of provincial life. Entertainment in Roman Dacia included the spectacles familiar throughout the empire. Amphitheatres hosted gladiatorial combats and animal hunts. Theatres presented plays and performances. Chariot racing attracted passionate fans. Public baths provided relaxation and social interaction. These entertainments helped integrate Dacia into Roman cultural life, giving provincials the same pleasures enjoyed in Rome itself. The amphitheatre at Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa could seat several thousand spectators. Here, on the site of the provincial capital, crowds gathered to watch gladiators fight and die. The violence of the arena was accepted as normal entertainment, a reminder that Roman civilization included brutality alongside its achievements. Dacians who had once fought Romans as enemies now watched Romans and others kill each other for sport. Public baths were essential features of Roman urban life, and Dacia was no exception. Bath complexes provided hot, warm, and cold pools for bathing. They also served as social centres where people met, conducted business, and relaxed. The baths represented Roman engineering skill, with sophisticated heating systems and water management. They also represented Roman values, emphasising cleanliness, leisure, and civilised living. The infrastructure of Roman Dacia impressed visitors and served practical needs. Roads connected cities and military posts, enabling rapid movement of troops and goods. Bridges spanned rivers and gorges. Aqueducts brought fresh water to urban centres. These engineering works transformed the landscape and demonstrated Roman power over nature. The road system was particularly important for military and commercial purposes. Roman engineers built roads that could withstand heavy traffic in all weather conditions. Milestones marked distances and honoured emperors who sponsored construction. Way stations provided rest and supplies for travellers. The roads of Dacia connected the province to the empire, making it accessible and governable. Trajan's bridge across the Danube, built by Apollodorus of Damascus for the Dacian wars, remained standing for over a century. This engineering marvel, with its stone piers and wooden superstructure, symbolised Roman mastery over the great river. Later emperors eventually dismantled the bridge to prevent barbarians from using it to invade Roman territory. But for generations, it stood as a monument to Roman engineering and the conquest of Dacia. Life in Roman Dacia varied greatly depending on one's social position, occupation, and location. The wealthy elite of the province lived in comfortable houses with amenities including central heating, running water, and decorated rooms. They wore fine clothing, ate varied diets, and enjoyed the pleasures available to the Roman upper class anywhere in the empire. The houses of the wealthy featured architectural styles imported from the Mediterranean. Peristyle courtyards provided light and air to surrounding rooms. Mosaic floors displayed geometric patterns and mythological scenes. Painted walls added colour and sophistication. Furniture included couches for dining, chairs for sitting, and beds for sleeping. These homes would have been recognisable to visitors from Rome or any other major city. Heating was essential in the Dacian climate, which was colder than the Mediterranean regions where Roman architectural styles originated. The hypocaust system, which circulated hot air beneath floors and through walls, kept homes warm during harsh winters. Maintaining these heating systems required constant attention and fuel, typically wood from the abundant Dacian forests. Dining among the wealthy followed Roman customs. Meals were taken while reclining on couches, arranged around a central table. Multiple courses featured local and imported foods. Wine-accompanied meals served mixed with water according to Roman practice. Dinner parties provided opportunities for socializing, discussing business, and displaying wealth and culture. The diet of wealthy Dacians included foods from across the empire. Local products such as grain, meat, vegetables, and dairy formed the foundation. Imported luxuries added variety and prestige. Olive oil came from Mediterranean regions, essential for cooking and other purposes. Garum, the fermented fish sauce beloved by Romans, was imported in ceramic containers. Spices from distant lands flavoured dishes for those who could afford them. The middle ranks of Dacian society, including merchants, craftsmen, and minor officials, lived more modestly but still comfortably by ancient standards. Their homes were smaller and less elaborately decorated than those of the elite. They ate simpler diets with fewer imported luxuries, but they participated in Roman urban culture, attending public entertainments, visiting the baths, and engaging in civic life. Craftsmen in Roman Dacia practiced trades essential to provincial life. Blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and hardware. Potters produced vessels for storage, cooking, and dining. Weavers made cloth for clothing and household use. Carpenters built furniture, vehicles, and structures. Leather workers crafted shoes, belts, and other goods. These artisans worked in shops, often living above or behind their workplaces. The organisation of crafts followed patterns common throughout the Roman world. Craftsmen often clustered in particular neighbourhoods or streets, creating districts associated with specific trades. They formed associations called collegia that provided mutual support, organised religious observances, and represented their interests to authorities. These associations gave craftsmen a collective voice and social identity. Merchants played crucial roles in the provincial economy. Some operated locally, buying and selling goods within their communities. Others engaged in long-distance trade, importing products from distant provinces and exporting Dacian goods to markets across the empire. Successful merchants could accumulate considerable wealth and rise in social status. The common people of Roman Dacia, including farmers, labourers, and the urban poor, lived harder lives with fewer comforts. Rural farmers worked the land as they had for generations, though now under Roman law and Roman landlords. Their homes were simple structures providing basic shelter. Their diets consisted mainly of grain, vegetables, and whatever meat they could afford or hunt. Agricultural labourers worked on estates owned by wealthy landowners. Some were free workers who hired out their labour. Others were tenant farmers who worked land in exchange for a share of the harvest. Still others were slaves with no freedom and no rights. The agricultural workforce that fed the province included people of all these categories. Urban labourers performed the physical work that kept cities functioning. They loaded and unloaded goods at markets and warehouses. They built and maintained buildings, roads and infrastructure. They hauled water, removed waste, and performed countless other tasks. Their work was hard, their pay was low, and their lives were precarious. Slavery existed throughout Roman Dacia, as it did throughout the Roman world. Slaves worked in homes, on farms, in mines, and in workshops. They had no legal rights and were considered property rather than persons. Their treatment varied depending on their owners, ranging from relatively mild to brutally harsh. The mines of Dacia were particularly notorious for their harsh conditions and high mortality among slave workers. The slaves of Roman Dacia came from various sources. Some were descendants of Dacians enslaved during the conquest. Others were purchased from slave traders who obtained their human merchandise from wars, piracy, and other sources across and beyond the empire. Still others were born into slavery, the children of enslaved mothers inheriting their mother's status. Manumission, the freeing of slaves, was possible under Roman law. Some slaves earned or purchased their freedom. Others were freed by owners as rewards for loyal service or in owners' wills. Freed slaves became freedmen and freed women with limited citizenship rights. Their descendants could become full citizens, eventually erasing the stain of servile origin. Women in Roman Dacia occupied subordinate positions in a patriarchal society, but they were not without influence or agency. Wealthy women managed households, raised children, and participated in social life. Some owned property and conducted business. A few achieved public recognition through religious roles or charitable activities. The legal position of women was defined by their relationships to men. Unmarried women were under the authority of their fathers. Married women were under the authority of their husbands, though Roman law provided some protections. Widows gained more independence, controlling their own property and making their own decisions. Throughout their lives, women navigated a system designed by and for men. Marriage in Roman Dacia followed Roman legal forms. Marriages were arranged by families, with considerations of property, status, and alliance outweighing romantic attachment. A bride brought a dowry to her husband's family. The wedding ceremony included rituals and celebrations that marked the transition. Divorce was legally possible, though social pressures discouraged it, except in serious circumstances. Children were valued as the future of families in the province. Infant mortality was high by modern standards, making each surviving child precious. Children of wealthy families received education and preparation for adult roles. Children of common families began working at young ages, learning trades or helping with family enterprises. Childhood as a protected period of play and learning was largely a privilege of the wealthy. Religion permeated daily life in Roman Dacia. Household shrines honoured family gods and ancestors. Public temples served community worship. Festivals marked the religious calendar with celebrations and rituals. People sought divine favour for health, prosperity, and protection. They made offerings, performed rituals, and consulted priests and oracles about important decisions. The religious landscape of Roman Dacia was diverse and syncretic. Traditional Roman gods stood alongside deities from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and other regions. Local spirits and traditions, perhaps including remnants of Dacian beliefs, blended with imported religions. People might worship multiple gods for different purposes, seeing no contradiction in diverse devotions. Death and burial practices reflected religious beliefs and social status. The wealthy were buried in elaborate tombs with inscriptions commemorating their lives and achievements. Grave goods accompanied the dead, providing for their needs in the afterlife. Funeral rituals included processions, eulogies, and commemorative meals. The dead were remembered through annual observances and maintenance of their tombs. Common people received simpler burials, but even they were laid to rest with some ceremony and grave goods. Cremation and inhumation were both practiced, with preferences varying over time and among different groups. Cemeteries outside city walls held the remains of generations, silent testimony to lives lived and ended in Roman Dacia. The passage of time brought changes to Roman Dacia. The province that Trajan created evolved over the decades and centuries that followed. New emperors brought new policies, economic conditions fluctuated, external pressures mounted. The Roman Dacia of the 3rd century differed significantly from the province established after the conquest. The prosperity of Roman Dacia could not last forever. By the middle of the 3rd century of the Common Era, the province faced mounting pressures that would eventually lead to its abandonment. The story of Dacia's decline reflects broader patterns of crisis affecting the entire Roman Empire during this troubled period. The 3rd century was a time of profound instability for Rome. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, often violently. Civil wars disrupted administration and diverted military resources. Economic problems, including inflation and trade disruption, undermined prosperity. And external enemies pressed against the frontiers with increasing intensity. Dacia's geographic position made it particularly vulnerable to these pressures. The province extended north of the Danube, separated from the empire's heartland by the great river. This position had strategic advantages when Rome was strong, providing a buffer against northern barbarians, but when Rome weakened, Dacia became exposed and difficult to defend. The peoples beyond Dacia's frontiers grew stronger and more aggressive during the 3rd century. Germanic tribes, including the Goths, migrated into the regions north and east of Dacia. These newcomers were formidable warriors who posed serious threats to Roman territory. The Goths would eventually play major roles in the transformation of the Roman world. The first major Gothic incursions into Roman territory came in the 230s and 240s of the Common Era. Raiding parties crossed the Danube, attacking Roman settlements and carrying off plunder and prisoners. The Roman military response was hampered by civil wars and other distractions. The frontier defences that had protected Dacia for over a century began to crumble. The situation worsened dramatically in the 250s. Large Gothic forces invaded Roman territory, penetrating deep into the Balkans. Emperor Decius led an army to repel the invaders, but was killed at the Battle of Abritus in 251, the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy. This disaster shocked the Roman world and demonstrated the severity of the Gothic threat. Dacia suffered repeatedly during these decades of crisis. Gothic raiders attacked the province, destroying settlements and disrupting economic life. The mining operations that had made Dacia valuable were disrupted. Trade routes became dangerous. The population declined as people fled, were killed, or were carried off as slaves. The prosperous province of Trajan's creation was becoming a wasteland. The Roman military presence in Dacia weakened as troops were withdrawn to fight civil wars or defend other frontiers. The legions that had garrisoned the province were needed elsewhere. Local defence forces could not compensate for the loss of regular troops. The province became increasingly difficult to hold and increasingly costly to defend. Emperor Gallienus, who ruled from 253 to 268, struggled to hold the empire together against multiple threats. He achieved some military successes, but could not reverse the overall pattern of decline. During his reign, effective Roman control over much of Dacia was lost, even if formal abandonment had not yet occurred. The decision to abandon Dacia officially came under Emperor Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275. Aurelian was a capable military emperor who worked to restore Roman power after decades of crisis. He defeated various enemies and reunified the empire. But he also recognized that some positions were no longer defensible. Aurelian concluded that Dacia could not be held. The cost of defending the province exceeded any benefit it provided. The population had declined drastically. The mines were no longer productive. The military resources required to hold Dacia were needed elsewhere. The emperor made the difficult decision to withdraw. The evacuation of Roman Dacia was a major undertaking. The remaining Roman population, including soldiers, officials, and civilians who chose to leave, had to be transported across the Danube. They brought what possessions they could carry. They left behind homes, farms, businesses, and the graves of their ancestors. For many, it was the end of everything they had known. Aurelian resettled the evacuees in a new province south of the Danube, also called Dacia. This Dacia Aureliana, as historians call it, provided a home for refugees from the abandoned territory. But it was not the same as the land they had left. The mountains, the forests, the cities they had built were now beyond Roman control. The withdrawal from Dacia was not complete or instantaneous. Some Roman population may have remained in the former province, either unable or unwilling to leave. Roman influence persisted in some areas for years or even decades after the official abandonment. The transition from Roman to post-Roman Dacia was gradual and complex. The peoples who moved into the former Roman province were diverse. Goths occupied some areas. Other Germanic groups claimed different territories. The Carpathian Mountains, which had sheltered the Dacians before Roman conquest, now sheltered new populations. The ethnic and political map of the region became fluid and fragmented. What happened to the Romanized population that remained in Dacia after the withdrawal? This question has generated enormous controversy, particularly because it relates to modern national identities. Romanian historians have traditionally argued for continuity, claiming that a Latin-speaking population remained in Dacia throughout the post-Roman period and eventually became the Romanian people. Hungarian historians have challenged this view, arguing that the Roman population left entirely and that Romanians arrived later from south of the Danube. The evidence for either position is limited and ambiguous. Archaeological finds show some continued habitation in former Roman Dacia, but the ethnic and linguistic identity of these inhabitants is difficult to determine. Written sources from the post-Roman period are scarce and often unreliable. The debate continues among scholars, complicated by nationalist passions that have sometimes distorted academic discussion. What we can say with confidence is that Latin-derived speech eventually became dominant in the region that had been Roman Dacia. The Romanian language is clearly descended from Latin, showing that Roman linguistic influence persisted or was re-established at some point. Whether this continuity was unbroken or involved later migrations and influences remains debated. The abandonment of Dacia marked the end of direct Roman rule in the Carpathian region, but Roman influence did not disappear entirely. The roads, cities, and infrastructure that Rome had built continued to shape the landscape. The Latin language, in evolving forms, continued to be spoken. The memory of Rome persisted in place names, traditions, and cultural practices. Roman Dacia was gone, but its legacy endured.